Okay, James, I think we can make a start.
Good. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and good morning. We're excited to present to you today a session on data ethics and the need for this in our data-driven and AI-driven world. First of all, I'd like to thank TRA Virtual Academy for creating this opportunity in speaking with you this morning. Next slide, Marco. My name is James Varnum, and I serve as Managing Director of Logical Operations European Headquarters, and I lead a team of education consultants across EMEA, India, Australia, and New Zealand, who position Logical Operations' portfolio of courseware and edtech solutions to training companies, consultancies, governments, and academia, as well as managing Cert Nexus's authorized training provider program. I'm joined today by Marco Meyer from Principia. He leads the firm's innovation and research, as well as Principia's technology practice. Marco has advised C-suite clients in S&P 500 companies across technology, banking, and professional services on organizational culture, responsible innovation, and ethical decision-making. Along with this role, he is also leading a research group on organizational ethics at the University of Hamburg. His research draws on organizational psychology, philosophy, and data science to help organizations avoid misconduct and contribute to society. Marco holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Cambridge and a PhD in economics from the University of Groningen. Marco and his team have also co-authored the Logical Operations Certified Ethical Emerging Technologies courseware, which maps to the Cert Nexus certification. Next slide, please, Marco. The topics that we'll cover today will naturally demonstrate the need for ethics when working with artificial intelligence and data-driven technologies. In order to segue into our discussion around ethics, we will start with the definitions of intelligent technologies, where it all started, where we are now, and where we will go. We will then move into identifying tech ethics initiatives from both nations and industry currently in place, and finally review the competencies needed within data and business teams from an ethical standpoint. Next slide, please. Although there has been a recent explosion in AI, it has a long history. And it's, interestingly enough, one of the only technologies that historically hasn't had much of investment. Today's discussion is centered on ethics in AI, but a reflection on the history of AI will provide the context of where we've been, where we're going, and why we need ethical frameworks. The concept of artificial intelligence was, in many people's eyes, started in 1950, following the publication of Alan Turing's publication, which determined whether a machine could demonstrate human intelligence. Following this, there was excitement and investment into AI between the 1950s and 1970s. However, this investment stalled in the 1970s, following Sir James Lighthill's conclusion that nothing being done in AI couldn't be done in other sciences. This spelled the beginning of what is widely regarded as the first AI winter, and investment in AI significantly slowed down until the beginning of the 1980s, with a short resurgence in applying AI to expert systems, which ultimately is complex systems that could do one thing well. Personal computers then came along and proved that they could do the same thing, but at scale, and the second AI winter began. The main breakthrough with proving the concept of AI driving not only technical innovation, but how it could fundamentally impact society was IBM's development of Deep Blue, which was a chess-playing computer who beat chess master champion Garry Kasparov. This sparked investment into AI research, with a number of landmarks through the 2000s, like Google's Grand Challenge. Until 2011, AI was highly concentrated as a research subject, rather than something which could be used at scale in business. But when IBM launched Watson and Apple launched Siri, AI finally landed on our laps as consumers and subsequently sparked utilization of AI models in the workplace. Google's acquisition of DeepMind led to the rise of general purpose AI and created the platform of AI in business and for personal use. Next slide, please. So during the last 5 years, AI initiatives have exploded across the world. And the reason for this is a combination of some of the inventions and developments that we've covered on the previous slide, but also that we now have the computational capabilities which held back common use of AI in the early part of the century. We now have the technology which supports complex deep learning AI, as well as scalable solutions to benefit consumers on personal computers and even on cell phones. Global adoption is rapidly accelerating, both from a resource perspective as well as capacity, which has resulted in countries all over the world establishing national AI initiatives. Next slide, please. From an enterprise perspective, there is a lot of opportunity. According to Statista, revenues related to enterprise AI applications are expected to reach close to $35 billion by the end of this year, and projections show a tripling of this by 2025. AI has yet to release its full potential. We see in our home lives applications like Siri and Alexa, but we don't see widespread transparency of applications used in business. However, every sector is now heavily investing in AI, and we can see applications being used cross-sector to autonomize tasks, whether that be in talent recruitment, predictive financial outcomes, marketing automation, and supply chain management. Next slide, please. Research that was conducted by IDC finds that one of the biggest opportunities for AI in the Middle East and Africa is in the financial sector, where it's estimated that 25% of all AI investment in the region in 2021 will be spent on developing AI solutions. This is followed by public services, including education and healthcare, and the manufacturing sector. So this shows a targeted intent for the GCC countries to transition into an emerging tech global hub and reduce the financial dependence on commodities. Next slide, please. PwC have also conducted research into the impact of AI investment. And if we look at the UAE specifically, AI contribution to GDP by 2030 is predicted to be at a level of 13.6%, which in dollar terms is around $96 billion. Compared to other regions in the world, outside of the US and China, the greatest investment is coming in equal measure from the GCC, the UK, and Germany, which further identifies the intent of the strategy in the region. Next slide, please. If we look specifically at the telecom sector, this really is the epicenter of technological growth, which has been largely led by mobile and broadband services in the Internet of Things era. Predictions of continued growth are consistent, and the driver of this growth is AI. Today's communication service providers face increasing demands for higher quality services and better customer experience. And telcos are capitalizing on these opportunities by leveraging the vast amounts of data collected over the years from their massive customer bases. This data is consumed from devices, networks, mobile applications, geolocation, detailed customer profiles, service usage, and billing data. And the next step is harnessing the power of AI to process and analyze these huge volumes of big data in order to extract actionable insights and provide better customer experience. Also to improve increased operational capabilities, increased revenue through products and services. These are the four areas which telcos are utilizing AI at scale, namely network optimization, preventive maintenance, virtual assistants, and RPA. Next slide, please. However, whilst data-centric solutions provide opportunity and the world of AI is exciting and full of innovation, for the first time, we're developing systems that make decisions based on the data that is presented to it. Society has been plagued throughout history due to human bias, and in this technological age, we must not fall into the trap of creating solutions which are running off data which is biased in any way. There are already a number of stories where bias or discrimination in AI has impacted criminal justice, healthcare, financial services, and recruitment. Next slide, please. Deloitte Insights have concluded from their research that 3/4 of organizations say that ethics is important to their success. And yet only 1 out of these 7 companies say that they are ready to address these trends. Some of the key roadblocks include a lack of competencies, a lack of knowing where to start with implementing ethical frameworks into an organization, and quite frankly, apathy due to untransparent or complicated legal governance. Ultimately, technology is increasing at a pace where organizations cannot keep up in an ethical or non-biased way. Next slide, please. What we can see is that data and AI ethics are considerations, and they're considerations on the rise across the world in both private and public sectors as more automation takes place and more solutions are released onto the market. Next slide, please. OECD have been instrumental in garnering agreement from nations to adopt ethical principles into AI practices for a few years. These ethical practices include AI systems that respect and safeguard the rule of law, human rights, democratic values, and diversity. Transparency is also critical so that people understand when an AI system is being used for predictions or decision making. OECD have now identified over 300 AI policies from around the world as more nations launch national AI strategies and as the legislative machine starts to warm up. Just like with data privacy and GDPR, which came out of Europe in 2018, it's likely that similar regulations will be adopted into law with regards to how AI and data is used ethically. The balance and the discussion between private sector and lawmakers is to establish regulations which don't stifle innovation and enable organizations to maintain competitiveness. Ultimately, nations have to recognize that not only investment in AI is necessary, but that in order to maintain credibility and transparency and transparently create a replication of human rights, which we have incorporated into technologies, this also needs to happen within AI and ethical AI and ethical frameworks are needed in order to maintain citizens' confidence. If we give AI enough data, it will know too much about us, which could potentially use against us individually if not kept tightly leashed. Next slide, please. But it's not only nations that are defining ethical frameworks. Large organizations are also helping in defining and advocating ethics in AI. For example, Microsoft's AI Ethics Committee helped craft the internal Department of Defense contract policy, and Google and OpenAI made recommendations like bias bounties or create third-party auditing marketplace in order to turn ethics principles into practice. Also to create more robust systems and ensure that AI remains beneficial to humanity. But let's take a step back now and get an understanding of what ethics actually is. What is driving the need for ethics and where ethical failure occurs? So with that said, it's my pleasure to bring Marco Meyer from Principia Advisory onto the stage right now, who will go ahead with the next few slides. Over to you, Marco.
Thank you so much, James, and a pleasure to speak to you all today. So as James said at the beginning, I had the privilege of being involved with crafting the course that leads to the certification that we'll talk about today. And I'm really looking forward to present some of this because we've worked on this now for a very long time, and it was a very fulfilling process to go through that. And it's really great to see that come to fruition now. So let's start with a really basic question. What even is ethics? At a fundamental level, ethics is just the capability of consistently doing the right thing. And that seems on the one hand very mundane and simplistic, perhaps even, but it is a particular challenge when you try to act ethically in an organizational setting. And that is because if you're trying to be ethical in an organizational setting, it is not sufficient to just comply with social standards, legal norms, even religious standards. Because for many of the decisions that you face in business, there just aren't those clear standards. And that is particularly true when it comes to new technologies and AI. So what's a critical capability that every organization that uses emerging technologies needs to develop is to reflect about how people and data systems together impact society, to create awareness of ethical risk within your organization, and to design systems that support people to consistently do the right thing. And if there is one message that I really want to land today, then that message is this isn't only for the engineers who need to take an extra course on ethics. In order to make ethics real and efficient in an organization, everyone has to start thinking about it and to raise awareness of it. And a lot of it isn't technical in character at all. So what really drives all this need for ethics and the need for building this ethical capability? I think the biggest driver is that regulators and lawmakers also have identified how critical that is in organizations. That it's not going to be enough to give organizations a new rule book and say, those are now your ethics rules, play by that book. You really need to build this broader capability in organizations. So legal and regulatory requirements are perhaps the biggest driver. And this is also what Deloitte finds in a recent survey. And then if you combine that with a second factor, namely that AI technologies are rapidly adopted in the workplace, then you really see why the ethics of emerging technologies becomes particularly important. And I'd be quite keen to discuss when we have time later to what extent you see AI adopted around you. From my work at Principia, I can really see it affect every single organization that we're working with, and sometimes in ways that you even need to reflect about, that there's AI built into this tool. But it's everything from HR systems to how you communicate with customers to how you build your products. And then in addition to that, there are a couple of other factors. So one factor is that organizations are less cohesive. There's more of an alternative workforce coming into play as well. The people that are loosely associated with the organization are perhaps part of a network. And that creates, on the one hand, opportunities, on the other hand, ethical risks for organizations. And lastly, it's now consumers, investors, NGOs that have woken up to the risks of emerging technologies as well. And they pressure organizations to think more about this. So let's think a little bit about how ethical failures come to be. What are the root causes of ethical failures? And I want to start from an example that most of you probably know, and that's often in our minds paradigmatic instance of an ethical failure connected to emerging technology. And that's the case of Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica was a technology and consulting firm in the UK, and they built a tool to collect data from Facebook users and from the friends of those Facebook users about their personality. And at the same time, they also collected data about topics like the parties those Facebook users preferred, those political parties, and their preferences across a whole battery of issues. They used AI to build a tool to predict from the personality of people what their political preferences would be. And this tool was used in the US presidential campaign, in the Brexit campaign in the UK, and in other domains, with the intent to sway voters in a particular political direction. Now, you may have ethical questions about that purpose in the first place, but the thing that everyone agrees on is that the way that Cambridge Analytica collected data was violating privacy standards. And that is because they didn't disclose to the people that used the tool how the data would be used, and they even took data not only from the people that interacted with the tool, but also from their friends. So that's a very clear intentional violation of privacy standards. And of course, the result is that not only Cambridge Analytica has been dissolved, it's no longer a working company, but also every political campaign that is associated with Cambridge Analytica has been tainted by association with this company. So that is one type of case of an ethical failure. And there is a big, it's important to be aware of this type of ethical failure, but there's also a big risk when we reduce ethical failures to this type of intentional violation of an ethical standard, like a privacy standard. And the risk is this: we look at ourselves and at our organizations and we think we would never do that. Right? When I look at organizations that have problems with ethics, this is because they have bad intentions. They try to do bad or even evil things. Whereas I know about me and I know about my team that we would never contemplate doing such a thing. And this is why I don't need to worry about this. So in psychology, this has been identified as a bias. It's called ultimate attribution error, and it works essentially like this. When you look at the behavior of other people and it's bad behavior, then you tend to think that bad behavior was intentional. When you yourself do something bad, then you tend to assume you just made a mistake. This has nothing to do with bad intentions. And this dissimilarity about how we judge others and how we judge ourselves, that can lead us into a trap, namely that all bad things that happen, especially ethical bad things that happen, are always due to bad intentions. So the opposite is the case. And this is why I come back to this key message that I really want to send to you, that everyone in the organization needs to think about this. We covered one root cause of ethical failure, and that is bad intent. Cambridge Analytica is the example. And we'll now just very briefly give you a sense of 3 other cases of ethical failure that have to do with 3 other root causes: lack of awareness, bad analysis, and bad governance. Let's turn to awareness. And in my experience, this is perhaps the most important driver of ethical failures associated with new technologies and organizations. Facebook has a while ago released a smart camera. It's called Portal. And it's essentially an iPad, and it has a really cool camera on top. And that camera can track people across the room. It can track their voices. So what you can do with that is you can put it in one corner of the room, and you can walk around the kitchen or wherever you are, and the camera will always follow you. So it makes you much more mobile. You don't need to stay put. So this tool, right before its release, had a big flaw. And that flaw was only discovered by accident by one of the women of color that worked on the engineering team. She noticed that when she sat in front of Facebook Portal together with a white colleague, the camera would always center on that white colleague and never notice that she was in the picture as well. So it turned out by accident, really days before the planned release, that the tool was far less good at detecting people of color than it was at detecting white people. And the reason for that was not bad intent. No one set out to design the tool like this. The reason was simply that the data set that had been used in order to train the algorithm that powers the smart camera had a lot of white people in it and very few people of color in it. And that's why it was worse at it. So that is an awareness challenge, because the challenge for the organization is not to figure out what the right thing to do is. Once they had discovered it, they knew they had to retrain the algorithm. The challenge is really to become aware that there's a problem in the first place. And with new technologies, there are always issues in areas where we wouldn't expect them. So awareness, really critical root cause of organizational failure. So let me just briefly touch on two others. One is struggles with deciding between important values regardless of which decision you take. So consider the case, the decision that Apple had to make in 2015, when there were terrorist attacks in the US, and the FBI asked Apple to essentially help them hack an iPhone of a suspected terrorist in order to find out more about that group and to track those terrorists down. Apple refused to do that because Apple said the privacy of our users is so important, and we promised we wouldn't do that kind of thing. So we can't help you, FBI. The FBI, of course, said, this is about safety. This is about discovering threats to national security. And that's more important than privacy. So this is a case where you have important values on both sides, privacy and safety, and you need to make a trade-off. And that requires ethical reasoning skills. And if you don't have them as an organization, then it's easy in those difficult decisions to make the wrong call. So finally, there is something, and there's a root cause connected to governance. And that has really to do with how you incentivize and reward people in the organization. And the example that I want to use is YouTube's recommender system. If you have used YouTube, you know that after you have watched a video, you're immediately going to be suggested the next video to watch. There's an algorithm powering the proposal which video that's going to be. And that algorithm is called a recommender system. We have now really good research that shows that the recommender system is producing bad outcomes for people that selected harmful content to start out with. Essentially, if you go to YouTube, you start looking at slightly harmful content, the algorithm is built in such a way that it will probably lead you down a rabbit hole to more and more harmful content. The reason for that is that the algorithm is optimized to keep you hooked on the site and to make you stay, to spend more time on YouTube. And because engineers had been given this incentive, maximize the amount of time people spend on the website, they build the recommender system in that way. Had they been given a different incentive, for instance, say, spend meaningful time on Facebook, or at least a constraint, make sure we're not promoting conspiracy theories, other harmful content, then the recommender system would have been developed differently. So that's an important type of root cause of ethical failure, because it shows how really setting incentives and having management think about the ultimate result they want to achieve with their product is absolutely critical to steer tiny decisions that engineers are going to make down the line. So what we're trying to achieve with Seed is really to build those skills in organizations to avoid root causes of ethical misconduct and make ethics into a positive force to drive positive change in organizations. And I talked already a little bit about those skills that are needed. Just to highlight again, this is for management. This is for people that work in communications, and that is, of course, also ultimately for technologists handling data on data technologies. In different organizations, ethics sits, or the main responsibility for ethics sits at different places. So here's a top-level view of what a team might look like that develops a new data-driven product. You have a manager organizing it all, a salesperson who's ultimately responsible for bringing it to market, an accountant that makes sure that everything works within budget, a product technologist that leads a team of data engineers and software engineers that ultimately produce the technology. And in some organizations, humanities specialists who come from philosophy or sociology or psychology and really just focus on bringing in this humanities perspective. In principle, any one of those roles can have primary responsibility for ethics, but the most important thing is that you don't park it with any one specific person, but that it really is a shared responsibility of everyone in that group, just in order to make sure that we're avoiding all of those 4 root causes of unethical behavior that are highlighted. So what does it mean? What does it require to build those skills in your organization? We believe it requires that you do additional training for everyone who touches emerging technology. And I've just listed a couple of roles here for whom that is important. So you see policy roles, you see a lot of technical roles around data analysis, data science, data engineering, business analysis, and so on. But you also see roles like communications, management consultants, procurement officers. We're quite happy to discuss how any one of those roles touch important ethical decisions in the discussion. But how do you start? James already presented all of those different frameworks that pop up around the world and all of these different initiatives. So when we started developing the course for SEED, we really found this huge circle of different initiatives. I think this lists something like 39 or so different policy frameworks around AI ethics. It's very confusing when you start looking at it. What we have done with SEED is really to isolate the key themes and the common themes behind each of these frameworks and bring them together in a practical way so that organizations can get started with the core of ethics. So let me just say one thing about how the course is structured before I hand back to James. And that is just to say the course is structured in 5 different components, hitting 5 different capabilities that we believe organizations must now build. So the first is to promote the use of data-driven technologies in a way that has always ethics top of mind to avoid those organizational failures. The second thing is to move from an abstract understanding of ethics and ethical principles to something very practical. So the wheel that I've just shown you indicates that you can read any number of documents on ethical principles. But the big question that we're trying to answer in the course is, how do you make those real in your organization? How do you build processes? How do you build good practices? What are good tools in order to build ethics into the day-to-day? So the third course then dives into detecting and mitigating ethical risks. And those are centered around privacy, accountability, transparency and explainability, fairness and non-discrimination, and safety and security. And those 5 themes essentially cut across all of those different little dots that you just saw on the last slide. And then in course 4, we move to communicating effectively about ethics. This is important both for internal communication to make people aware of the importance of ethics, but also for external communication in order to explain to stakeholders, customers, regulators, and so on, how you're keeping the data safe and how you're behaving in a responsible way. And then finally, in course 5, we touch on a lot of the themes that are important in order to create and lead an ethical data-driven organization. So think again about the YouTube example. It was really all about setting the right kinds of incentives and using the right kinds of metrics in those management and governance topics. So this is what we touch on in course 4. And I hope that makes you somewhat excited about that course. And I'll hand back to James.
Thanks very much, Marco. Yeah, so just to clarify from Marco's previous slides, where it has 5 different courses, the CEAT course, or the Certified Ethical Emerging Technologist, which is the full title, is actually one course. Those 5 elements, I guess you could call more specializations in a way. And the course itself will be a 3-day a 3-day course in the traditional format. So 9 to 5 or that type of thing. So just to clarify that CEAT is one course, and those are more the 5 specializations that are covered within it. Next slide, please, Marco. So that course outline that Marco just explained actually prepares candidates to take the Cert Nexus Certified Ethical Emerging Technologist exam, which is comprised of these 5 domains, which will certify that the successful candidate has the knowledge, skills, and abilities required to apply foundational ethical principles following industry standard frameworks, identify and mitigate risks, and navigate ethical organizational governance in order to devise and maintain ethical, trusted, and inclusive data-driven technologies. Next slide, please. The exam itself is comprised of 80 questions, which candidates must answer within 120 minutes duration time. The pass score has been set at 62%, and the exam can be taken at Pearson VUE test centers or remotely using Pearson OnView. Next slide, please. So as a recap on what we've discussed so far, organizations that would benefit from having employees attending a CEAT course and attaining the Certified Ethical Emerging Technologist certification are those which are required to comply with data privacy regulations, whether that be GDPR or national regulations. In line with that, organizations that collects, processes, or stores large volumes of data, and then using this data to gain intelligence from it, who then develop algorithms and build AI models to put this data to work. Ethics by design should be a part of every organization, which means the embedding of ethical and humane use principles into the process of designing, developing, and delivering software and services. In practice, this means empowering employees to apply ethical use principles such as human rights, privacy, safety, honesty, and inclusion in products developed. Next slide, please. So just to go through, if some of you haven't heard of Cert Nexus before, the CEAT certification has been developed by Cert Nexus, who is a global certification body. And over the last 3 years really has established itself as the purveyor of vendor neutral emerging technology certifications and micro credentials for business, IT, and security professionals. Their credibility stems from the rigor of the certification development, which is in accordance with the American National Standards Institute guidelines and compliance with ISO 17024. Local accreditation with organizations such as KHDA in Dubai and international bodies such as the National Cybersecurity Center in the UK and the US Department of Defense and many others has provided thousands of candidates in over 60 countries the confidence that Cert Nexus certifications demonstrate knowledge to fulfill job skills requirements in AI, data science, IoT, cybersecurity, and now, of course, AI and data ethics. Certifications are developed with third-party, industry-based subject matter experts who together establish the certification blueprint, which Cert Nexus then use to develop the exam content. Next slide, please. So this slide isn't designed purely to show some of the large organizations where candidates have come from, but more to identify the breadth of sectors that these certifications apply to. So technology is now driving every business in every sector, and AI is at the forefront of this, which means that ethical frameworks are needed to be implemented as broadly and with as much gusto as information security and data privacy frameworks to ensure that we harness the power of AI without it infringing on our human rights. Next slide, please. The SEAT certification in the bottom right-hand corner was launched in November 2020, following a pre-launch of the course in September 2020. And so far, we've seen almost 10,000 candidates sign up to this course. This slide shows the entire Cert Nexus roadmap, which covers 5 technology tracks across which are mapped against different target audiences within any organization. The think level of micro credentials at the top empowers decision makers, executives, and project managers to lead, design, and put emerging technologies into practice. We then have the build level, which helps expand IT and development professionals to create, implement, innovative solutions. And the secure level extends cybersecurity professionals' competencies to protect your assets. So to conclude, before we kind of wrap up with questions, when reflecting on this session today, please remember that ethics in technology is a fast-growing, business-critical, and politically sensitive field needing investment. It is applicable to any data-intensive company or industry. And to help you, SEAT is the only vendor-neutral, high-stakes certification available. And if you find others, you're welcome to contact me personally, and I'll be happy to explain the differences to you. I believe we've got an area where we can ask some questions now, but there's my details there. You can also scan the QR code there, which takes you to my Linktree profile, where you can find other details around the SEAT certification and connect with me on social. But from there, I'd like to thank Marco for his time this morning at short notice, and thank you all for listening. And again, thank you to the TRA Virtual Academy for allowing us this opportunity to speak with you. And at this point, happy to receive some questions.